In Tuesday's election, Nebraskans will vote on two competing measures that both center on abortion rights.
KTV's Connor Dredd spoke with Nebraska's Secretary of State about Nebraska initiatives 434 and 439 and breaks down the differences.
In 2023, Nebraska Governor Jim Pillen signed into law a ban of abortions after 12 weeks of pregnancy, with exceptions for sexual assault, incest, and if there was a threat to the woman's life. On the Nebraska ballots, voters will decide between two diametrically opposed initiative measures that both look to amend the state constitution. If passed, Initiative 434 would amend the Constitution to ban abortions in the second and third trimesters of pregnancy. There would still be exceptions for medical emergencies, incest, and sexual assault. Initiative 439 grants a constitutional right to abortions until fetal viability. Now, fetal viability would be determined by the professional judgment of the patient's treating healthcare practitioner. Nebraska's Secretary of State says that in order to amend the Nebraska Constitution, the total number of yes votes has to equal or exceed 35% of the total number of ballots cast in the Nebraska election. That's in addition to receiving a simple majority of votes in favor of the initiative. Secretary Bob Evans says that if the initiative doesn't get both, the initiative dies and they start all over again from the petition process. But what does it mean to write a new initiative into the state constitution versus just making a new law? Well, in order to overturn a state statute, you need a simple majority vote by the Nebraska legislature and a governor's signature. But constitutional amendments can only be changed by either a 60% vote in the state legislature and a vote by the people in an election, or with the approval of another initiated constitutional amendment placed on the ballot via a successful petition containing 10% of the state's registered voters. And once the constitutional amendment is in place, the rest of state statutes have to fall in line with that amendment.
All laws have to be consistent with the Constitution of Nebraska. To the extent that a law is in conflict with the Constitution of Nebraska, that law cannot be enforced. So the Constitution of Nebraska is the supreme law of our state, and the laws that are passed by the legislature, the statutes that are passed, have to comply with the requirements of the Constitution.
Now, with two separate initiatives, there is a chance that both get the 50% plus one votes in order to pass. So what happens if both initiative measures get enough votes in order to pass?
If they both win, then you'll take the measure that got the most actual yes votes, the most actual votes for that initiative. And so if they both win, you look for the one that had the most votes, actual votes, cast in favor of it. And that's the one that will go into the Constitution.
Now, in total, 10 states will have votes with abortion laws in the election, but Nebraska is the only one with two competing initiatives.